The path to mastery leads through the heart of adversity. Challenge is the raw material from which courage and strength are forged. Warriors are not defined by events. Warriors define them. Warriors conquer themselves before all else. Warriors are relentless in their service to others. Join us as we open our hearts and hone our minds to a razor's edge. It doesn't matter how slow you go, only that you do not stop. Your time is now. And now your host, Jason McKenzie.
Good morning and welcome to another episode of the Mental Health Warriors podcast. It's 5:27 on a Sunday and I actually totally sucked because I should have published this episode a long time ago. So I will own that. But regardless, I'm drinking a tea, the birds are chirping, it's Mother's Day, and we have a wonderful day planned. So this conversation is with my man Eddie Aguilar, and this is a really cool conversation. So I think I met Eddie through our Mental Health Warriors group, but regardless, this guy's a badass. He was one of those hotshot firefighters, like the forest firefighters you kind of see on TV, who, especially for the guys, when you see these dudes, you recognize that they're far more masculine than you are, or at least that's what I think anyways. And so we really get into talking about that. But Eddie's, the main part of the story is that Eddie's had an incredible amount of people in his life who've taken their own life. His own life has been touched by suicide in a way that most of us could probably not even imagine. So I give him a ton of credit for coming on here and talking about it. And also, he's had a gun in his mouth, right? And it's always fascinating to me. When I say gun in his mouth, he was moments away from taking his own life. And these kind of stories are so amazing to me because how do you come back from being in that place? Like, how do you have to change your thinking? How do you heal from the pain that you're in? And how do you live a life with intention and of service to others when you're coming from a place that is so dark and so painful? It just inspires the hell out of me. And I'll be honest, it's something that I have been struggling with lately. It's just not struggling with, but more like thinking a lot about is like, what is the role of healing, and what is the role of, developing yourself as a human being and learning skills like, being present and meditation and overcoming limiting beliefs and all of that kind of stuff, surrounding yourself with a higher quality of people, like what you would typically consider like the personal development. What a role does that have to play versus, the healing and those kind of therapies that will help you make sense of the past and all of that kind of stuff. Like I'm not an expert at all, and I don't in any way have a clear picture. But what I see in Eddie's story is a really interesting example of how healing is really, in his case, and I think in many cases, his healing and moving sort of through the pain is really focused around serving other people, and so I'm just really impressed by that, and I think I don't really know what else to say about it other than it's something I've been thinking about a lot, and I don't have a coherent way of forming my thoughts. But regardless, Eddie's got this smooth as silk voice that makes my nasal lisp sound incredibly grating by comparison. He's the host of the Mindset Mountain podcast, which I absolutely love the title on. I've had the privilege of being on the show, and I love people who are focused on mindset because it's something that we can control, and controlling it and changing our mindset, improving it, and developing our tool set is a critical component to having the wherewithal to create the life that we want. So, and he's also, and we talk about it in the podcast, he's also writing a book, sort of a compilation book around stories of suicide. And I don't really know where he's at with that. And it just reminds me that when I'm done recording and editing this podcast, I'm going to catch up with him and find out how he's making out with that book. But this is a great conversation. It's a great insight into the life of, some heroes that we don't normally get the insight into. I love some of his firefighter stories, but it's also a story of a man who's come back from literally about as close as you can get to the brink. He's turned things around and he's living a life of service to other people. And it's an inspiring story. And I'm proud to call Eddie a friend. And I'm proud that recording this podcast is making me remember to catch up with him. So enjoy the podcast, everybody, and thank you, Eddie, for everything you do. And although I do resent you because of your voice, but that is something I need to work on, brother. Okay, take care, guys, and see you on the other side. Eddie, welcome to the Mental Health Warriors podcast, my friend.
Hey, glad to be here. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too, man. I know we really haven't known each other that long, but I've been really impressed by the work you're doing and the journey you're on. So I think maybe a place we could start is just to get right into maybe one of your lowest points, which was that moment where you had a shotgun in your mouth. Can you take us through where you were at that point in your life, and then maybe we can work backwards from there and fill in the picture.
Yeah, that point in my life was about 12 years ago, and it was a point where a lot of what I had envisioned for myself growing up, and then as I became a young man, had kind of dissipated. You know, having a strong marriage, having a strong bond at home, great foundation, and instead I was in a toxic marriage, and it's just it was a toxic marriage. I was in Chicago, which is so far from where I grew up. I grew up in Arizona. I didn't have very many people to lean on physically, as far as having that personal communication with individuals in my life, and, struggling financially, trying to find work. I was out of my element. And right before I ended up getting to that low point, I had a friend that I would call all the time as I'd drive to work. I had about an hour drive to work, and I went from being this strong individual that was a hot shot or a wildland firefighter to selling cell phones at a kiosk in a mall. And so my life had just did a complete 180. And I had a friend that I would call, and I knew he was going through some tough times in his life. And so my medicine at the time was reaching out to him and trying to help him while he was still back here in Arizona, until one morning I got a call from his dad that he said, hey, he's like, I answered the phone, and I had actually left home early that morning just to escape being home with my wife at the time. And I got a phone call from Robert's dad, and I answered, and like, hey, what's going on? And he told me, he's like, Robert would have wanted me to call you. And my heart stopped, and I was like, what do you mean? He's like, we're going to take him off life support. He shot himself yesterday. And after that, on the drive home, I wanted to pick up the phone, and it was initial reaction is I picked up the phone and went to go dial his number, and I realized, shit, who do I have to reach out to now? So I went from an element of being a part of a team, a community of where I felt strong, to all of a sudden hitting a weak point in my life. And right after that, about a week after, I was I take that back. It was a couple days after he had been let go, that I was laying down. I'd been stressed to high hell, hadn't been sleeping much, and as I was falling asleep and I was halfway asleep, I felt the concussion of a gun to my head. And I jumped up and ran downstairs and just started crying. And it was at that point that I felt, okay, this is what was Robert's last feeling, what he felt physically last. And after that, I'm like, okay, if Robert did it and couldn't hang on anymore, then I could see where he was at. And it made sense to me. And so at that, no, I actually just, I felt it, and I felt it several times.
That a dream
I don't know
you
if
had?
it was, no, I actually felt like the concussion, the muzzle blast from a a gun towards my temple, and that's not how he shot himself, but that's where I felt it, and that was it. And probably within a couple of days later, I ended up getting into an argument with my wife at the time, and she had taken one of my daughter was already gone. She had taken my son, left, and said, "This is it." I loaded up the shotgun, and it's a Remington 870 Wingmaster 12 gauge. Put it in my mouth and just started crying. And as I started putting pressure on the trigger, I could feel the pressure still. I heard a voice, and it was Robert, and I heard him saying, "I just left my daughter behind, and now you're about to leave your 2 kids behind." And then I shoved the gun away from me and just started crying. And after that, I've never hit that low point again. I've never even contemplated, never even thought about it. And it's been a process since.
Wow, man, that is so powerful. So there's a lot to unpack there. So, I mean, in that moment when you heard Robert's voice, was that what did you take away from that? Did you take a sense of strength, that some type of different sense of purpose? Like, what did that give you in that moment?
It just told me that it wasn't my time. And the crazy part is at that point, Robert was like the 6th or 7th suicide I dealt with. So up to that point, I'm like, man, I would never hit that low point. I don't see how these individuals, these friends of mine or a cousin, had hit the low point. And some of it I understood to a certain degree, but when that happened, I've talked to some people, and some said that's God reaching out to you through Robert's voice, and some have said, well, that's Robert. That was Robert reaching out to you, keeping you from, it's not your time, and it sure in the hell ain't going to be your time. When it is your time, it's not going to be self-inflicted.
Wow, man. So, hey, one thing I wanted to ask you about is you mentioned you're from Arizona. At the time you were in Chicago, and how closely do you relate, or how much of a connection do you feel to the place or the land where you grew up in? Because for me, I don't feel that connection, because my dad was in the military and we moved all over the place, and I've just lived in a million different places, and there's not a particular area that I would consider, home for me. So, but I got the sense from talking to you that that's not the case for you. So how important was that to you, and what was the impact on you when you left?
When I left Arizona, you mean?
Yeah. Like, did you feel like you had left the place where you belonged in some way?
No, not at all.
Okay.
Because I've been the type that, I've been the type, I was a wildland firefighter for 12 years, 10 of those years as a hotshot. And I actually even went up to Canada twice, Alberta 1 year and Ontario another year. And so I loved it. I loved seeing new things. I loved meeting new people. So going to Chicago, the thing was it was a move that my wife at the time wanted to make. And so I'm like, all right, I'm down for this. Let's go ahead and let's make it happen. Let's create a life over there. The thing was, there's different circumstances. And when I got there was a lot of behind the scenes going on in the marriage aspect that brought about a lot of negative energy, and I had no place to reach. I had no place to go to reach out to somebody. And when I felt, my marriage or my wife, it was the one that we should be building, it wasn't there, and I didn't have that. But I did realize once I moved back to Arizona, was I ran into a guy at a gas station, and he's like, man, hey, how you been? It was a guy I used to see at the gym all the time. And I knew he was in construction, and he asked how I was doing and where I'd been. And I told him, and he's like, well, hey man, you just got back to town, but if you need work, just let me know. I got you covered. And I had already had a job before I even got back. And I was at Chili's with my kids, and a buddy that I used to live with and fight fires with walks in. He's like, hey, I saw your truck, man. So it brought back a sense of community and home, which I didn't have, when I came back. So yes, it did have an impact, so to say, but I thought the impact or the community and home should have been inside the house.
Okay, I gotcha. Hey, your microphone's clicking a little bit. I don't know if you're. I just wanted to let you
Oh,
know.
okay.
Um, okay, so then, I mean, you're in this dark place. You hear Robert's voice, and then what is the journey for you like after that? Like you mentioned that you've never again had a thought of suicide, and how do you start to climb out of that hole?
I went and saw a pastor, and when I was over there, and I tried to get my wife, for us to seek counseling, and we both went, and she wasn't down for it. So I'm like, all right, well, I got to fix me because I'm not happy with where I'm at. And I went and spoke with him, and we were talking, and he asked me a lot of the little simple questions. What makes you happy? What has made you happy in the past? What's brought you a sense of value, and so on and so forth. And it was one of those. I said, I've always been fit. I've always been athletic. I grew up playing football, baseball, basketball. I ran track. As a hot shot, you got to be in shape. And so that was the important aspect of my life that I wasn't taken care of when I was there. Also a sense of purpose, with the hot shots, I had a sense of purpose, and I had a community, and I had some people to lean on. And when I walked away from being a hot shot, I walked towards my family being my community. And at that time, it wasn't happening, and that's where I hit. So I started working on me, and then this happened in, I want to say in January, February, when this happened, and I made a commitment. Okay, I'm going to stay till summer, and then summer I'm moving back to Arizona no matter what. And when I moved back to Arizona, what was funny was my mom's real open. And I went and saw my mom, and I was a guy that weighed about 180 to 185 pounds. I was pretty solid, and I came back, and I never weighed myself. I had to be about 155, 160. And my mom's like, she's like, you look like shit. And I just laughed, and she goes, but you're home now. And she goes, so it's time to get you back to where you need to be. And it was one of those, it didn't hurt at all. That's just how we spoke. She just acknowledged. It was like, hey, you
Yeah.
definitely are not the man that left here. So let's get you back to where you need to be. So once I moved back, well, real quick,
Wow.
once I
So,
moved back, I started working for,
oh yeah, go
I
ahead.
used to own a tree company. So I called my ex-partner, and I'm like, hey, I need a job when I get back. He's like, all right, just let me know when you're here and you got a job. So I was up cutting trees, and I wouldn't wear gloves, and I was chewing up my hands and building calluses again, and felt like I was becoming a man's man again. And I would, cut trees all day, climb trees, lift wood, getting back in shape. And then I'd go to the gym for an hour or two. I'd run, and then all of a sudden I put back on a lot of muscle and started having that self-confidence and that value again, that I had community, I had people, and I was finding myself again and recreating myself as well.
That's a great story, man. So, hey, on a personal, like on a completely, well, maybe somewhat unrelated note, I want to hear more about being a hotshot. So, what is that? So, there's woodland. You mentioned a woodland firefighter, and then there's a hotshot. And I think we all have this, or at least my vision is, you're imagining the forest fire and you're imagining the water bomber flying over it. So, what's the difference between those two things, a woodland
A
firefighter and a
wildland
hotshot?
firefighter and a hotshot, they're both. I mean, a hotshot's a wildland firefighter. A wildland firefighter is not a
Hmm.
hotshot. Not all. And what a hotshot crew is, it's a 20-person crew, and it's a national resource, and they have a Type 1 status. So some say it's the Navy SEALs of wildland firefighter. So you spend all summer long with the same 19 individuals. You have depends what crew you're on. The crew we were on, I was on two separate crews, but the crews I was on ran a superintendent, which was the head guy. Then you had a foreman who was second in charge, and then beneath the foreman you had two squad bosses, which the rest of 16 members were under one of those squads. And so the big impact of a hot shot was you didn't use water. A hot shot crew is chainsaws, Pulaskis, shovels, hand tools, and more of a fight fire with fire type approach rather than the bombers. So, there'd be times where you hike. I remember being in Idaho, hiking 5 to 6 hours just to get to the fire's edge because it was too smoky to fly us in, and then start working and going to town, or sleeping out on the fire line, or pulling 36-hour shifts. It's very, very intense. So there are, other types of wildland firefighters that work on engines. They're type 2 crews, which are the same, they have the same structure as a hotshot crew, but a hotshot crew is they're categorized in the system as a type 1 crew. And then you have a type 2 crew, which may not have met all the qualifications that a hotshot crew has.
So what is it like to be, I mean, I can't even imagine what it must be like you must have been in some fucking harrowing situations, man.
Yeah, it was intense, and that's what I loved about it. I went from, playing sports in high school to going to college my first year, not doing anything. Then my second year of college, I tried to walk on at a community college in Mesa, Arizona, which is just outside of Phoenix. And I lost a part of that, physical endurance challenge and mental challenge as well. And so I worked on an engine and paid my own way to college, which where I worked, we didn't have very many fires. And a friend of my mom and dad's was a superintendent of a hotshot crew in Flagstaff. He's like, hey, we need to get you over here. I said, yeah. So once I went over there, it was a whole different world. I mean, in 94, we racked up over 1,200 hours of overtime. And we didn't hit our first fire till the end of May, and we were done, I believe, in September, mid-October. So that was a lot of time. I mean, our base hours were, I figured it out before, were like 960 base hours and 1,200 hours of overtime. So it is intense. And yes, we've been in some hairy situations where one crew had deployed fire shelters, and while the fire was being wind driven, and we had to jump, we walked in front of the fire to help get them out. Los Alamos, where they built the atomic bomb, was an intense situation. Mm-hmm. Very, very intense. That was the most intense situation I had been in, where it wasn't so much the fire aspect of it that was intense. It was, if this building had caught fire and ignited, it would have been devastating to the Southwest states. So to be put in some situations, yes, it was very mentally challenged and physically challenging as well.
Now, do you see it's, I guess, one of the things that's always been interesting to me, this is just, they talk about how fast a wind-driven fire can actually travel. And it's hard, I think, for anybody who hasn't seen it to imagine, but I guess it must be just incredible to see it in real life, just to see how fast it can progress.
It is. And it was funny is my mom's husband, we were talking one time, and he's like, I don't see how these people die on the fire. You just outrun it. It's like, no. Fire is being wind driven. It's being pushed. It's sending embers out in front of it. It's sending embers. It could send embers miles ahead of the main head of the fire. And so then you got a bunch of spot fires that are igniting, and it builds and builds. And, that's, as the heat rises and the smoke lifts, that fire needs to fuel itself with oxygen. And so it can blow up pretty quick.
Wow. So I'm curious about the impact of that type of situation on people's mental health, because I'm imagining, and correct me if I'm wrong, but people must, I mean, everybody, you guys are very highly trained, obviously, but regardless of that, people must respond very differently when they are, in terror, right? I mean, or their life is in danger. Did you see any type of like mental health impacts from people facing those situations over and over again, or maybe even trying to deal with, how they, maybe a time when they didn't respond in the way that they, were trained to respond?
Yeah, I saw many a times that happen, and even I went through it sometimes to where it's the mental, it's the thinking. Is this situation as bad as I think it is? And when you start to panic, and it's no different in life, you might you might get some bad news from a friend. You might have some, friend that ended up in the hospital or family member. It's how you perceive it, and initial reaction is like, oh shit, things are going to high hell here. Um, and the big thing with the good wildland firefighters is keeping your cool, calming down, and evaluating the situation. And the time where I was talking about where one crew deployed and we had to get in front of them, or I mean, go find them and then help get them out. We were standing on to where I was standing on top of a ridge where the wind was blowing consistently from one direction. And one of my supervisors is like, hey, get your shelters ready in case we got to deploy. And I'm like, dude, chill out. The wind's been at our back. It's blowing this certain way. Calm down. All we got to do is walk into the wind, walk off this hill, and skirt around, and we're fine. We're in the safest place of all people. And he started flipping out because this other crew deployed. And so, it's just the excitement of it all. It's like your thinking can be shifted, and the perception of what's going on can be, some people might think, oh, this situation isn't that bad, when those they're not looking for the flags. And as far as towards mental health, I had never seen anything fully impacted unless somebody was deployed in a fire shelter. And I had worked with one guy who actually had to deploy before I met him, and he deployed in a fire shelter with two other crew members. And they were with the Prescott Hotshots, and this was in '94 when he deployed. And they took, I want to say, 200 to 300 degrees within shelter. And I'm claustrophobic. So I always, just getting in those things beforehand to practice, because you had to do, I hated it. I hated it being in that. And people are like, what are you going to do if you have to deploy? I'm like, I'm not going to deploy. My fire shelter's on top of my head. I should not be put in that situation. But then I would joke and I would say, the chalk outlines on the ground, after, when the officer tapes the ground on where the body laid, I said, you're going to see a set of ashes in mid stride, I said, so I'm not going to deploy because I won't be able to stay in that shelter. But a friend of mine that I had worked with had deployed, and I don't see how he got through it afterwards. And the lack of oxygen, and you start losing oxygen, you're taking that intense heat inside the shelter, it's sucking the moisture out of you, and they were fortunate to survive. And that's the only time I've seen kind of the mental aspect of actual incidents. But I've worked with many hotshots, and one thing I've come to learn a little bit more was several of my friends that I fought fires with had committed suicide. And two of them, I think, were due to influence of steroids as well, because they were shooting steroids. And the only reason I know this is because I was looking at doing steroids before going into football, and I was researching steroids, and I'm like, oh no, this ain't for me. I can't do this. I got good control of my temper, but I know this would send me overboard. And one thing I found that when you're doing a cycle of steroids, you pyramid up. You start at a low number, increase, and then you pyramid back down. But one thing I found was that if you stop in the middle of a cycle, that your body's like, wait a minute, dude, what's going on here? And it starts to flip out, and it messes with your mentality. And two of my friends were both wildland firefighters, and they're both saucing, and they both got hurt. And I know that I shouldn't say I know, but I'm assuming that they both stopped in the middle of a cycle because they can no longer physically work out. So why keep shooting up? And they both had one had more intense situations than the other. And these are two guys that you would think would never do something of the sort as taking their lives.
Wow. Okay, so to take it back
Thank you for indulging my curiosity there. That was really
No
interesting.
problem.
I've only ever seen like this on Discovery Channel, so to be able to talk to somebody that's been there in real life is super interesting for me. So when you come back and there, you said you started working in the forest, cutting trees, and I think that's building some muscle back, having a sense of purpose, and I think that's a really important thing to touch on because, and we've talked about this before on the podcast, but it is an amazing antidote for people who are dealing with feelings of low self-worth or depression to you know, have a sense of purpose in their life, but also to face challenging physical situations, to put yourself into places where you need to work your body and struggle physically. And I'm surprised at how many people still ask, hey, what do you think the impact of say, for example, exercise on mental health is? And I think I think it's an important point to talk on because there's a lot of things that we can do to have a dramatic influence on how we view the world. So can you maybe touch on, as you're going through this process and building muscle, you mentioned that you're gaining confidence, but what other impacts did it have on your, I don't know, your state of mind, I guess?
A big part of and how I've referred it to some people that haven't, haven't focused on physical exercises is when we are, it goes to teens. There are a lot of teens and even adults that self-inflict harm on them. And it's a sense of release. It's a release of the inner emotion, the inner struggle that they're battling with. And, it's all mental. And I've always said that, why not? If you really want to inflict pain on yourself, drop down and do as many fucking push-ups as you can till you can't do anymore. Catch your breath and do more until you don't want to even do anymore. Oh, and guess what? You know what the side effect of that is? You start building muscle. You start becoming stronger. And then all of a sudden you start doing push-ups a little bit more and you do a little bit more. Well, guess what? Those 5-10 push-ups that you'd only do at the beginning, now all of a sudden are up to 25, 30. And then you keep going, and you can use that to carry you over in other aspects of life. And how I reflect that, sometimes sweating is the body's way of crying. It's releasing the shit that's in it. It's releasing the stress. It's letting it go. And it's rebuilding. Yes, it's tearing it down. It's tearing the muscle groups down. But it's also rebuilding. And in the long run, you're going to add strength. In the long run, you're going to have a sense of confidence when you look in the mirror, and if it's just a metaphor, so to say. I shouldn't say it's a metaphor, but if you can do that, now you can start transferring that physical exercise, that struggle, that physical endurance, or, improving your physical endurance, carry that over to other aspects of your life. And I think it's huge.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I never heard anybody put it like that. It's the body's way of crying, but I think there's something to that for sure. So you have had an almost unbelievable number of people in your life take their own life. I mean, I think you've said it's about 20 people. Like, God, I don't even know how to tackle that topic. I mean, is there, I guess, what are some of their stories? Or is there a common thread that runs through those stories? Or how do these things, I mean, I know they've changed the trajectory of your life, and we'll definitely get into that, but I don't know. Can you maybe talk about what that's been like for you, or what you've learned by being surrounded by that kind of tragedy?
It wasn't until I was talking to Robert's mom when I moved back to Arizona, and I went and saw her, and I couldn't afford a trip to come back for his funeral. And that was devastating in itself. But when I came back, she was one of the first people I went to see. And I said, you know that Robert's like number 6 or number 7, somewhere in that, I forgot what it was. And she just said, she's like, Eddie, she goes, I think there's a reason. You're supposed to have a hand in this somehow. And as I look back, the first suicide I dealt with was when I was 17. I was a senior in high school, and it was my cousin. And the crazy part about that was the whole week leading up to that event, up to that incident was I knew somebody in my family was going to commit suicide. And it wasn't just a thought like, oh, somebody in my family might commit suicide. I was going to bed crying, knowing somebody in my it was a strong feeling, and it might have been coincidence. But I had to write a paper and do a small paper, and then we had to give a speech on suicide, whether it was selfish or not. And I got into it, but then afterwards I had a strong feeling that it was going to happen. And within a week, I lost a cousin to suicide. And then a year and a half later, a friend of mine that was a pallbearer for my cousin committed suicide. And then 2 years later, a friend of mine that I grew up with, I was a pallbearer for the second guy, he committed suicide. And all of a sudden, I'm like, what the hell's going on here? And I'm looking at a list of names here that there's different scenarios and different situations. You know, a couple teenagers that acted on emotion at a certain period of time that probably more than likely wouldn't have. A guy that I worked with, you know, killed his girlfriend and then her son, and then took his own life. And then I had a friend of mine that was married to another hotshot buddy of mine that was a victim of murder-suicide. And she was raising a daughter. She adopted a daughter who happened to be the daughter of a friend of mine who died of cancer. But the daughter's mom, who I'd fought fires with, they committed suicide. So looking at the list of names in each situation, some I believe was totally mental health, that it was something was not right physically, you know, in their brains and whatnot. Some of it, you know, a couple of them I felt were because of steroids. Some I felt were loss of purpose, you know, like with veterans. Though I wasn't a veteran, I understand a veteran as they come back now because they were a part of something. They had a purpose. They had a belonging. They were part of a community. They were part of something super, super strong, which a lot of wildland firefighters were as well. So when they leave it, the big question is, well, who am I now? I'm no longer a hotshot. I'm no longer looked up to. Go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to jump in there because I really think that this is an important point that you bring up, because I don't know if you've read the book Tribe by Sebastian Younger, but I think it came out last year, and we did a book club on it in the Mental Health Warriors group. But that's basically what his premise is. Like, people, there's this kind of narrative, and this is his contention, and it makes a lot of sense to me. But there's this narrative that, you know, people go over and they go to war, and they come back and they have so much trouble integrating back into society. And people, like, the common narrative is like, oh, you know, they can never find the adrenaline rush or whatever it was when they went to war and blah, blah, blah. And I think that's bullshit, man, because if you read what Sebastian Younger says, and he's been embedded with, you know, like troops in like, you know, he did that documentary Restrepo, like in this remote outpost in Afghanistan, enemy fighting all around them. And his contention is, though, is exactly what you just said, which is that there's a sense of camaraderie that is literally life or death.
Yeah.
And that gives you such a sense of purpose and meaning that when you come back, there's basically, especially in today's society where we're wealthy to the point where nobody, you know, we're not really at risk of dying because of running out of food. We've all got some sort of shelter in some way. And so when you come back, there's almost no way to replicate that deep sense of camaraderie. And that's what people really struggle with, and trying to find a purpose and trying to find that level of human connection.
Oh, most definitely. And I agree with that. And some people can adapt and work, you know, and adjust to the situations and find another sense of community, but some people can't. And I interviewed a guest on our podcast, AJ Richards, who went through this. And one thing he shared with us was that, you know, back in the day when it was World War I, World War II, how many vets can find other vets that would understand their situation, understand the stresses of war, the struggles of war, losing friends, the, you know, extreme situations that they overcame. But now more and more and more, there are less soldiers to connect with other soldiers. Or it might be, your community is a prime example. You created a community of men to reach out to other men that are struggling with same situations, so to say. The battles of mental health, the battles of depression, the battles of self-worth. So once those communities can be found, there are many men out there and many women that are struggling to find a sense of purpose or a sense of belonging, or somebody that will understand them fully of what their pains and their struggles are.
Yeah, totally, man. Okay, so sorry I interrupted you there, but we were talking about sort of the impact of those suicides, and you were talking about some of the different reasons that you believe that maybe some of these people got to that dark place. And one thing you mentioned was um, a few minutes ago that you were doing a paper at some point on uh, whether suicide was selfish or not, and that's always been such an interesting concept to me, because I think that for people that, I think why what we're doing right now and together in this moment, and also that the work that you're doing that we'll definitely get into right now, it's so important to shed light on, you know, I don't know how people sometimes get to that point, because if you haven't experienced it firsthand, it's almost impossible to imagine, and and I only know it. I haven't experienced it firsthand. I've only experienced it secondhand with watching my wife, but I also understand how dark the darkness can truly be. And if I hadn't witnessed that firsthand, man, there's no fucking way I could ever have imagined it. You can't. And so when I hear people say it's selfish, it doesn't really upset me very much. I just know that it comes from a place of lack of understanding. And I think drives it home to me, the importance of what we're doing, right now. But what are your thoughts on the idea of, taking your own life being sort of the most selfish thing you can do?
Well, I don't mind arguing, but one thing I hate, and I don't mind debating, but one thing I hate is losing. So this is, this is when I was a senior in high school, and my initial thought was, hell yeah, it's selfish. That's the most selfish act you can commit, because you're going to hurt family members, loved ones, and anybody close to you. And it is selfish of you not to think of anybody else. And I'm like, all right, Eddie, so let's play devil's advocate. Somebody's going to challenge you. Somebody's going to question do you have good ground to stand on? So I thought about myself. I'm like, all right, yeah, my parents are divorced. It was an ugly divorce. But my dad still loves me. My mom still loves me. I live in a small town, about 2,500. Both sets of grandparents are there. I had a lot of uncles and aunts there. I had a lot of cousins. I had good friends. I had friends of my mom and dad who I looked up to as parents as well. So if I were to commit suicide, then yeah, that'd be a freaking selfish act. But then I started playing devil's advocate. Well, what if I'd been molested as a kid? What if I lived on the streets? What if my mom and dad weren't around? What if they didn't love me and treated me like shit? What if I didn't have my grandparents to go to? What if I was homeless? All these certain other scenarios in life that I knew were out there, but couldn't comprehend. And I went to the thought of being sexually abused, and I'm like, how the hell would I get through that? How could I? And I'm like, okay, now this puts a whole different twist on it. And so I didn't have an answer that it was selfish, and I didn't have an answer that it wasn't selfish. And to be upfront and honest, in some circumstances, I think it could be a selfish act. Because then I thought about myself. Well, if I were to commit suicide, that'd be a selfish act. You got all these great things, and you're choosing to ignore it. And yeah, that's selfish of you. But there are other situations where I don't think it would be selfish, because there's a backstory to the backstory that we don't know. Jason McKenzie has a backstory to his backstory. Eddie Aguilar has a backstory to the backstory. You as a listener have a backstory to your backstory that only you are keeping within. And so until we truly dive into each situation and each suicide and decide whether it's selfish or not, I don't even bother labeling whether this one was a selfish act or not. Plain and simple, it's just tragic It's a tragic incident. It's a tragic act, and it's it hurts a lot of other people.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really beautiful way to put it, man. And I think the fundamental point of what you're making is really that who are we to judge the motivations or the rightness or wrongness of anybody else's choices? We can't it we don't know their backstory, and those backstories can be so incredibly complex. And it's just, yeah, I don't know. I can't put it any better than you just did. So I really appreciate you taking the time to share that point of view. And I'm pretty impressed by the fact that, at the age when you were in college, you were astute enough to be able to play devil's advocate with yourself, because I sure as hell wasn't. God, when I was that age, man, I would have just taken the point of view that it was selfish. And if anybody didn't agree with that, they were basically a fucking idiot. So,
Well, I was a
so good
senior
for,
in high school when that happened. But
well,
like I
even
said,
better.
I hate losing. So
Yeah.
I don't mind arguing. But I also know when to shut up. If I don't have ground to stand on or no comprehension of what's being spoken of, I just shut up. I'm like, no, I'm not going to entertain this. I'll voice an opinion based off of the immediate facts that I've been given or supposed facts. But outside of that, it's just an opinion until I dive deeper into it. So, yeah. It's
Yeah, that's great, man. So now before we get into what you're doing, I mean, maybe I'll touch on it a little bit, which is, you're really passionate about sort of telling the stories around suicide and of, the loved ones who have survived after. But how did you start to come to the realization that this was something important that you needed to be doing?
back when I was in Illinois. When I drive to work, I was always into photography. I love taking pictures, but I never wanted to be a photographer. But I always loved photos and the power of photography. And I drove by this one studio every single day. It's in Barrington, Illinois. And I'm like, I want to see what this guy does. For whatever reason, I was attracted to this photographer's studio. I never went in, and I was there for a whole year, never went in, and I looked him up, and I saw he had done a book. And I moved back to Arizona, and I was in Arizona for the summer, and then I went back in the fall to visit for my daughter's birthday. And I'm like, I'm going into this guy's freaking studio, and I bought one of his books. Well, the book he had done was on autism, and it was powerful photos, very powerful photos of kids that were autistic, but then of the family members, the moms, the dads, and then the written stories in there that, this is what it's like to deal with the autistic child and the struggles and the stresses and the life's no longer normal or what I envisioned for myself as a parent. I'm like, holy shit, this is powerful. And as I was thinking about suicide, I'm like, what if Robert had known what he was going to put his mom through? What if, these other individuals know what they're going to put their brother through, their sister through, their wives, their girlfriends, or whoever? And I'm like, if there was just something out there that would give them a tip or a clue to maybe they just happen to come across it or just happen to present itself at the right time, that they would stop and think like, oh shit, yes, life sucks. I really want to end my life, but how would my kids grow up? How would my mom move forward? How would my dad move forward? And that sparked the idea. And so I reached out to several family members of those that I knew that had committed suicide, and I had some testimonies from certain individuals, and that kind of led to where I was going now. But even getting the book done has been a major, major struggle with me. And I've interviewed certain folks, and I interviewed one lady that I met through an internet marketing company, and met her through there. And then I actually met her in Vegas, and I had read somewhere that her son taken his life. And so I interviewed her, and I recorded it. I had it on speaker, and I recorded it. So then I went and jotted it all down, put it on paper, and then after that, I went to piece her story together. I was in a funk for about a good week plus. And it wasn't that I was depressed. I was just gone. It emotionally drained me, but then it started scaring me. And I'm like, what if people think bad of Robert? What if people think bad of Spuck? What if they think bad of Richard? What if they think bad of Dawn? Oh my gosh. And then what if they think bad of these individuals that are sharing their stories with me? And I ran from it. And it was in and out of the I'm going to deal with this. I'm going to get this book done, or I'm going to speak on it. And then every time I tried to walk away, it was like God saying, hey, dude, I'm not letting you off the hook. This is where you need to be. And this is what you need to get done. And it just was, I don't have a problem with speaking and sharing. And I started sharing my story. And it became easier and easier. And through the process, I've been in a situation to help several individuals. Some I don't even know. Receiving an email in one instance. Another was a friend of my dad's that I never met, that at my dad's funeral, that had asked me if I wanted a testimony because I mentioned something about suicide. And when I was in ICU with my dad before he passed, I'm like, I'm walking away from the suicide deal. I need a job, a good job with benefits. I need to raise my kids and so on and so forth. And my dad's funeral, one of my dad's friends wanted to give a testimony and gave me all the reasons why he wanted to take his life. And I'd just been put in a situation too many times that it's like, Eddie, if you're not going to get it now, come on now. So I get it, but it's still a struggle. And it's just, I got to be one of the voices out there.
Yeah, there's a lot of things you are saying here that just are really connecting with me. Like I gave a talk.
Are you there?
Like I think the stories that you're helping people share are so important. I gave a talk at a memorial last year for family members left behind by people who had taken their own life, basically. And the gist of this memorial, while it was obviously an important thing, and it was, but they were telling, the only stories that were being told were the stories of the people who had taken their own life. And when I talked to them, to the audience, my main message was like, obviously it's important to tell these stories, and to honor your loved ones in this way. And I know that it's part of the grieving and healing process to do that. But the reality is they're dead and you're alive, and you have stories that are equally as important to share. So if you're, please do that, because there's so much that comes after suicide that people need to understand, because it's fucking messy, man. Like it's not just the stories of, I was in, like, about how sad I am. It's the stories like, I turned to the bottle. I started, I got addicted to drugs. I fought for so many fucking days to try to understand and process this pain. It impacted me in ways that you might not ever even be able to imagine if you hadn't experienced it, and it's such a complex thing. But I think also the stories of healing are equally as important. Like, how did that happen? And what did, like, I look at my own personal situation, and I know we've talked about this, but, and I've probably said it on the podcast a million times, but I will continue to say it, is that whole experience was a crucible time in my life that forced change that I never would have experienced otherwise. So if I had just a regular, normal, sort of quote normal life, with and been complacent, and I don't know how I'd be right now, but I'm very confident that I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. And there's so many different facets to these stories that people need to hear. Because they need to understand that if they're really in a lot of pain and doing things that are maybe counterproductive to cope with that pain, that they're not alone. But they also need to understand that, man, there's hope. There is hope after this tragedy, right? And you can emerge from it a very different person with an opportunity to leave maybe a more significant mark on the world.
And I agree 100% with that. And having dealt with so many suicides and seeing family members go through with what they're going through is, like I said, I've been put in too many situations. And one prime example was I was with this network internet marketing group, and I went to this event in Vegas, and I'm standing in front of the door to get in, and I start talking with this lady, and she's from Salt Lake, and she's like, so what company are you with? And I'm like, I'm with this company, and I'm here to learn about this, blah blah blah. And we start talking, and I mentioned, the thing about suicide, and she goes, oh, she's like, in Salt Lake, she goes, we have a high suicide rate in Salt Lake. She goes, if I can get you to come speak at an event, would you come speak? I'm like, heck yeah. And she goes, okay, just give me some time. And, this is very important. And I'm like, have you dealt with it? She's like, no. But she goes, I know it's important. There are too many young kids that are taking their lives in Salt Lake. And she's like, I don't know what's going on. So I get back home. So within a week after meeting her, she sends me an article that the governor had acknowledged a high suicide rate in Utah. And she goes, Eddie, she's like, I want you to write something for this. And I'll take it into the office. So I wrote it. She did some editing. Then I finished it, cleaned it up. And she's like, all right, give me a week. And I'm going to take this in personally and hand deliver it. And, I want to try and get you up here to speak. I'm like, sweet. So a week after that, she messages me and she's like, hey, give me a call. She's like, I know why we met. And so I call her. I'm like, hey, what's going on? And she's like, hey, she's like, are you still willing to come up here and speak? And I go, yeah. And she goes, well, I got the perfect platform for you to speak at. And I go, well, when is it? She goes, next Saturday. And I'm like, Saturday? I'm like, that's kind of an odd day to, come speak at an event. She goes, I know why we met. And I'm like, why is that? She goes, my son just took his life. And,
Wow.
and I've just stopped. And my first thought was, no, this ain't what I wanted to speak for. This is not what I want to speak at. She goes, Eddie, I'm going to acknowledge it. I'm going to be open about it. And I would love it I would appreciate it if you can make it up here to come speak at his funeral. And I was like, holy shit. And so during that week, I told, I'm like, hey, here's what you're going to be going through. You're going to be pissed. You're going to be angry. You're going to be sad. You're going to be mad. You're going to start blaming other people. You're going to try and find closure. You're going to try to answer questions that you have no answers for. Only he has the full, complete answers. And she started going through these range of emotions. And I would tell her, be pissed. Be pissed at him. Be pissed at your ex-husband and this and this and this. And then forgive and let go and quit being, and I helped her through the process because I'd seen it so many times. And she's like, I know why we met. And, I didn't have the financial means to get up there, but I knew some nonprofit back in my hometown. I reached out to him and I said, hey, here's what's going on. I need to go get up there. He's like, well, if you can get some money donated, have it donated to our nonprofit, then we'll turn around and we'll help you get up there. So I reached out to several businesses here locally in Flagstaff, and they said, yeah. So they donated to the nonprofit. And then the nonprofit turned around and helped me just, get up there and speak. And I spoke at the funeral, and I was interviewed by Fox News and the Salt Lake Tribune. And afterwards, this man walks up to me. He's like, I want to thank you. He's like, that helped a lot. I said, I'm sorry. I said, are you an uncle or how'd you know him? He's like, I don't know him. He's like, I read about that you were coming to speak. He's like, I lost my son to suicide. And he goes, I'm trying to grasp some understanding. And he's like, thank you, you helped me. And he gave me a book. He ended up sending me a book. And I talked to him later and I said, if you'd like to share your story or talk, he's like, no, my wife does not want people to know that my son committed suicide. They think it was an accident. And so they were hiding the fact that their son, the mom wanted to hide the fact that their son had taken his life because, embarrassment or shame, which is something that we need to get rid of, and help get rid of. So.
Yeah, and you're doing important work and doing that. It's funny, isn't it, how sometimes the path that you're meant to be on is the one that you resist traveling
Hmm.
down, but you just continue to get these signs that this is the way forward, no matter how hard. Sometimes it drags you along. You know, fate has or destiny or whatever it is has this way of dragging you along, kicking and screaming to finally accept it and throw your whole heart and mind
Exactly.
into it.
Yeah, I believe that.
Cool, man. Well, hey, listen. So, where are you at with the book, and are you looking for more people to contribute? Like, tell us more about how the audience might be able to, more about specifically what you're doing and how the audience might be able to help you.
I battled this left and right. It changes. It's gone and changed and changed. And yeah, I need more testimonies. Well, I need to write more. And more recently, I made a deal with my girlfriend. She had some, she's always, she loves to hike, but she injured her knee. And she stopped hiking and couldn't work out because of a lot of the pain. And she's like, I need to start working out again. I'm like, all right, you work out, all right. So I was writing every day, and I was writing, and I was writing this, for a good week. And I finally stopped, and I realized, like, Eddie, you have enough. You have several testimonies. Okay? You got the testimonies. Enough to start. This book is never going to be completed if you're looking to get more testimonies or to write more. It's like you can always do a second book. What you need to do is get this book out there immediately, get that done, and you can always come back with another book. You can dive more into the mental illness aspect of it. You can dive more into the soldier or PTSD aspect of it. And right now you got a good foundation and to use that. So as far as the audience needing help and assistance out there, it's not so much, I can get many testimonies, and I think that would be awesome for another book on down the road. But for me, it was kind of the realization is the second book isn't going to come until you get the first book. And I think I was hiding from completing the book by continuing to work on it, so more so to just keep writing and writing and reach out for more testimonies. And so I kind of acknowledged that with myself and said, all right, you have enough. Now just go and clean it all up, piece it all together, and get this thing done. So as far
Right on, brother. So it's you got everything you need, and it's just time to put your head down and I know the feeling. Make the final tweaks and get it out there and release it to the world. That's got to be a combination of terrifying and exciting and extremely
it
fulfilling.
is, and like I shared yesterday with you guys on the call that we were on, was connecting with you, and then seeing what I'm gonna throw his name out, Adam Lowry with Cognitive Rampage. I was totally blown away by how much I don't know. And the big aspect of the book was, why, who am I to speak on this? Even though I've helped people, not take their lives. Who am I to put this book out there? I don't have the credentials. I don't have this or that. But I've always been able to easily click into the right mode when I was put in a situation where somebody was contemplating suicide. But I'm not a doctor, and I tried to stay away from that. I'm not an expert, so to say. But the thing that I found is that I have the full life experiences. I've had the gun in my mouth. I know what it's like to hit that low point. And I've helped, my buddy Robert's mom get through Robert's suicide. And that took like 6-7 years. That took a long time. And she finally let it go. And then unfortunately she passed away about a year after had a brain aneurysm. But I was at peace because she was no longer holding on to that guilt of Robert's death. So I think it's just time to clean this book up, get it done, and get it out there. And, I've shared some pieces before. I shared one piece with you before, and, I have some more to share, and I figure why not share parts of it now while you're in the process, and it's unedited. And the whole reason on that is because that's us. we're unedited our whole lives. There are always things to clean up. There are always things to fix up. We're not our Instagram photos, so to say, always touched up and the blemishes cleaned up and all this and that. And why not be that and accept it and embrace it? So the thing with you and Adam that you guys have brought to me was, at first was a fear, because I'm like, oh, there's so little that I know. Now I'm diving into deeper. And it's like, well, all right, great. Now that you can get this foundation laid out with this book, now you got other resources that you can refer people to. In the book, I have no problem sharing, the Mental Health Warriors podcast is going to be out there. Your coaching is going to be out there. What Adam has to offer is going to be out there. I'm going to put it all out there for other people to dive into. Okay, Eddie might not be my cup of tea, but Lowry might be, or Mackenzie might be, or whoever else is out there that Eddie's learned from.
Yeah, no, you know what? That's such a great point. And it's funny because Adam's been a guest on the show, first of all, and I will definitely put a link to, I want to give him a huge shout out, and I'll put a link to his podcast, Cognitive Rampage, in the show notes, because it's well worth listening to. I love when that guy gets on a roll.
Oh,
man.
Yes.
But
he's amazing. I love him.
Oh, yeah. But I think what's really important, though, is the how much there is to learn for everybody, basically. So, I've learned more about mental health and suicide and trauma and healing and all of those things in the last probably 6 or 7 months than I have in my entire life leading up to this moment. So, the time is always now, right? You can always learn, and there's so many good resources out there to help you. And it's not just like, there's so many interesting facets to mental health, and what we've talked about, some of them, like there's the medical aspect to it, there's the trauma aspect, but one of the other things that there is that we talked about earlier on the podcast, which is developing more mental and emotional resilience, I would say, is mindset. And you have actually a podcast that I was fortunate and honored to be a guest on earlier this week. So maybe, and you talk a lot about mindset in that podcast. It's really the theme of what the podcast is about. So do you want to tell our listeners about it? And we'll definitely throw a link in there in the show notes as well, because I highly encourage you to check it out.
Yeah, the Mindset Mountain podcast was something that Jason and we met at a network internet marketing event. And
different Jason, by the way.
Jason Legard. And I met him at an event, and just real brief, we talked for not even 5 minutes. And at the time, I had a YouTube show with another guy, another friend, and him and I were interviewing individuals, and they would come on, and it would be video, and we would get them to tell their stories of struggle. And it was called Empowerment Hour. And during that Empowerment Hour we would have individuals tell their story of struggle and how they overcame their struggles, whether it was thoughts of suicide, financial struggles, physical health, so on and so forth. And so during that time, I was looking to create, there's a young man that committed suicide here in Flagstaff. And I went to the school district, and they wanted nothing to do with me. And I was mad. So I'm like, screw this. I'm going to create my own event here. And so I talked to my buddy, and he's like, yeah, I'll fly in from Wisconsin. And then it's like, all right, we need another speaker. And I'm like, who should we get? Well, as part of this community, they did websites is what they did. And Jason did a lot of videos on there, and he was a very powerful speaker on camera. And so I reached out to him, especially since he was in Phoenix, just a couple hours away from me, and we connected. And then later, him and he was like wanting to come up to Flagstaff because he's in the desert. And for those of you who don't know, I'm in Arizona, Flagstaff, Arizona, but I'm in the Pines. We're at 7,000 feet. We get snow here, so on and so forth. And he's like, man, I need to get out of this heat. I'm going to go hiking. And let's go. And I'm like, yeah, come on up. I got some elk meat. We'll barbecue and get up here and we'll go hike. And then he reached out to me. He's like, hey, let's create a product. And I'm like, sure. And so he came up here and we talked about it the night before, and we'll call it Climbing the Mindset Mountain. And this is where I felt strong, was because, a lot of this was due to my dad. He was a Vietnam vet, Purple Heart recipient, but he always taught how everything was based on, it's all in the head. And he taught that through baseball. And I saw him work with so many individuals on the thinking of your thinking, how important your thinking is. Why'd you strike out? Well, did you walk up to the plate confident? What happened with there, or any aspect of sport? Was the mentality of it was just more important, just as important as the physical aspect of it. And so we created this product called Climbing the Mindset Mountain, and we had a couple mentors, and later they were talking about podcasting, and they talked to Jason, and man, you guys should start a podcast. So we called it, the Mindset Mountain podcast. And a lot of it is the same situation that I had with the YouTube deal. Was we've had individuals that come on and share their stories of how important their mindset was when they were struggling. And anywhere from a good friend of mine named Jess, who at one point in her life was actually contemplating suicide, but it was just her and her daughter, and she was actually thinking about taking her daughter's life and then her life. And then she did it. And she explains her story on her thinking and what shifted and transitioned. And, she works behind the scenes for 7-figure earners, marketers, coaches, and how life transitioned to, to having, we had Sean Stevenson from the Model Health Show, and the author of the book called Sleep Smarter, which I'm going to reference in the book as well, to how he struggled with being diagnosed with degenerative spinal disease, and how he cured himself through foods and exercise. So mindset's the beginning. It's your thoughts, your ideas of how you evaluate each incident, each event, your daily life, your mornings, your evenings, your days, Mondays. Are you more excited on Fridays than you are Monday because the weekend's coming? So the mindset's your thinking, and how we can shift our thinking to benefit ourselves, to adjust our self-talk, something we spoke of yesterday on that call we were on, just why do we always talk negative about ourselves? How come we can't talk positive about ourselves? In shifting and adjusting our thinking. Mm-hmm. And it isn't I shouldn't say it isn't the most important aspect, but to me, that's where it begins. I always look at it as I go hike Mount Eldon, and it's 2,400 foot climb, 2.6 miles, and it's steep. And when I stand at the base, it's referencing looking up at the top. Okay, there's my goal, there's my objective. Now, what's going to happen in between? Am I going to roll an ankle? What if it rains on me? What if there's lightning? What if I got to stop and help somebody that's hurt? How quick can I get to the top? And, or am I going to stop? What am I going to do when I want to quit? All those different aspects. And mindset to me is important. It's the foundation to your action taken or your lack of actions. So you can twist that and turn it so many different ways, in my opinion, but we want to do it to help individuals to shift their thinking of, from I'm worthless to I got a lot to offer this world. Or, okay, if I went through this, well, Jason McKenzie went through that, and that's 10 times worse than what I went through. So if he did it, then why the hell can't I do it? To offer different scenarios and situations. So yeah, to me, mindset is huge. It's a foundation. It's your starting point in moving forward.
Awesome, brother. I think that's a great place to end it. And as I said, I'll make sure to include links to the podcast in the show notes page. So for our audience, who I'm sure is going to be interested in learning more about you and connecting with you, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you, brother?
The best way, if you really want to reach out and contact me, shoot me some feedback or whatnot, is eddie@mindsetmtn.com. And for your listeners, and I was going to do this anyways, but I wanted to do it with you first, was I want to go ahead and offer a couple pieces of my writing, and also just the journey of what's going through. And I don't have no issues of sharing parts of the book now, just because it is a process. Somebody might need to hear something now rather than waiting for the book. And to me, that's huge. That's going to be huge in helping me get this book completed. And I figured, why not? It doesn't have to be edited. You might get some misspellings. You might get some, run-on sentences. I don't care. It's not to be evaluated as a book, but it's what value can be offered might be in a piece that I share with you guys. So I created a link. It would be mindsetmtn.com. So I abbreviation for mountain. So mindsetmtn.com/mental health. And that'll be for your listeners to go ahead, enter an email address, and I'll send you some pieces of my writing that are going to be in the book, and also just some insights on, exercise, the importance of alkalizing, so on and so forth, to give some feedback now rather than wait for this book to be fully completed.
That sounds great, brother. And I can say, as somebody who's read some pieces of your writing, I highly recommend that you take Eddie up on this offer. So listen, brother, you're a mental health warrior. Thank you so much for being on this podcast, and thank you so much for being a friend.
Well, I appreciate you. Like I said before, I've seen your name pop up through several individuals that I've known and have met, and never really dove into seeing what you're about. And it's been a blessing to find out what you have going on. I'm super hyped about what's ahead for you as well, and can't wait to even put out your episode on our podcast, which is coming out within a week. So it's gonna be good. Thank you, brother.
Okay, buddy. All right, take care, man.
And there you have it, a great story by a great man, Eddie Aguilar, co-host of the Mindset Mountain podcast, which is the greatest podcast in the world because I have been a guest on it. I jest, of course. But thanks, brother. I really, really took a lot away from this conversation. And I give you a ton of credit, man, for coming back from a spot that was so dark and so bleak and remembering what was truly important. But maybe even more or equally as important as that is just being fucking relentless about driving yourself forward and finding ways to serve other people, because the work you're doing is incredibly important. And I find you inspiring, and it's people like you I love having in my life, because people like you make my life better. So just keep pushing, brother. And if there's anything we can do to help you, I can do to help you, I will. So I'll end this podcast like I end every other podcast, and that's by saying, if you're struggling, I want you to know that I have struggled too. And if you ever want to talk to me, I will not judge you. See you next time.